Let's make the German bake Russian plucked cake. This thickened cheesecake has a chocolate pâte sucrée crust and is topped with little bits that resemble the onion spires on the Orthodox churches in Russia that are so well known around the world. To make our crust, we're going to use a food processor to sift our dry ingredients. All-purpose flour is being combined with baking powder and cocoa powder. This can totally be done by hand, but once you start making pastry in a food processor, it's kind of tough to go back. I mean, I do enjoy the meditative moments of working in butter with my fingertips, but at the same time, I'm just sacrificing a bit of extra cleanup for that speed and convenience. With your dry ingredients sifted, we can add our sugar, eggs, room temperature butter, and let the blitzing commence to make a nice soft dough. If you're like me and you forgot to add your orange zest, this is a good time to do it before it actually starts forming a dough. Just microplane a bit of that from this wonky orange into your thing and start the pulsing process to get this to combine. It's going to take a few minutes, and once it starts pulling away from the sides, beginning to form a ball, that's when you know it's ready. You don't want to overmix this, so as soon as it starts to come together, you can call it a day. Normally when making pastry, especially for blind bake applications, I wouldn't do the last step in a food processor. I would combine that gently by hand just to help decrease the chances of bounce back, but in this case, it's not a huge deal. So I'm using bees wrap instead of plastic, making this into a nice little package and refrigerating for 30 minutes until setup. In the meantime, we can start melting our butter. This needs to come to room temperature before we can add it to our filling, so it's a good thing to do during that resting period while the dough's in the fridge. Once our pâte sucrée has rested a bit in the fridge, we're going to unwrap it and begin forming it into a rough pastry. Flour's your friend here, don't be too afraid, although you don't want to do too much in case it doesn't come together. That's not foreshadowing. Okay, you can tell it's not coming together, so a little bit of work just to bring the butter a little bit closer to room temperature, make this a little more homogeneous, and make rolling it out a little bit easier. It's not a huge deal, especially when you're trying to keep a dough as short as possible. So, second time around, rolling away from yourself with quarter turn intervals is a great way to make sure you don't pull back any dough you're working with onto the rolling pin if it's sticky at all. Checking to make sure you're going to have enough for your crust. I'm going to have it about 2 centimeters or about an inch just to cover the sides and create a nice rustic side. Set your super short, already breaking a bit in the middle dough to the side. Crumple up some parchment paper to get into those corners. This doesn't need to be a pretty cut job. As a matter of fact, I think it looks better with the wrinkles that this provides. And begin the piecing it back together process. Not that this is always something that happens, but it's a good way of knowing, again, not to belittle the point that a super short dough is going to be the most melt in the mouth, crumbly thing. For our filling, I have cornstarch, salt and sugar, vanilla extract, our room temperature melted butter. Combine them in a food processor with some room temperature eggs and room temperature cream cheese. You'd see quark being used normally in Germany, but in the US where I am, it's pretty hard to find quark unless you make it yourself. I started with the dry ingredients on the bottom just to make sure they were blitzed up into the mixture as this went. Once it's nice and smooth, we can put it into our crust. And as a healthy adult with no immune system problems, I look forward to enjoying the remnants of this container off the spatula while it's baking in the oven. And the plucking can commence. A nice dry pastry is going to ensure that these stay in little dome shapes. I'm making dome parentheses right now because it's kind of an abstract dome. I mean, you could spend time rolling these into a ball, but just large chunks that aren't too close together is going to ensure they come out nice and separate, and a beautiful golden brown German Russian plucked cake for you to enjoy. One thing I really like about the German Russian plucked cake is that you can eat it pretty quickly out of the oven. You don't need to wait overnight like a regular cheesecake. That's a big plus for me. Also, the chocolate pastry, the pâte sablé, really adds a lovely crunch texture. It's so melt in the mouth. Good times. Let's make the German bake Russian. The German rough.